A king who was always faithful to God, an unexpected deadly illness, the visit of a prophet and a divine miracle. This is one of the most beautiful biblical stories. Welcome to Bible in Colors. The king was on the verge of death. The sentence had come straight from the mouth of the prophet Isaiah. Set your house in order, for you shall die. Hezekiah heard it, but he did not accept it. Instead of despairing, he turned his face to the wall and prayed. He wept, he cried out, and in that moment the heavens bowed down to the earth, because when the voice of prayer rises, the course of destiny can change. This is the story of when God heard it and changed his mind. Jerusalem was silent, not the silence of peace, but the heavy silence of fear. The walls that had once protected now seemed to suffocate. The throne was occupied, but the king was on the verge of death. Hezekiah, the man who had restored worship, who had broken the idols, who had trusted in the Lord when the armies of Assyria surrounded the city, now lay in his bed, with his life hanging by a thread. The prophet Isaiah enters, not with hope, not with healing, but with a sentence. Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. There was no room for doubt, not a shred of hope. The sentence came from on high. It was God himself speaking. Who would dare to argue? Hezekiah could have accepted it. He could have folded his arms, closed his eyes, and waited for the end. But no, something inside him refused to give in. Perhaps it was the same spirit that, years before, had resisted the siege of the king of Assyria. Perhaps it was the memory of God's deeds in his life, or perhaps it was simply faith. Faith that God still hears. Faith that not even a divine sentence is final when the heart breaks before the throne. At that moment the king turned his face to the wall, not to hide, but to isolate himself from everything and everyone, even the prophet, because there are prayers that do not need an audience. Hezekiah wept, not as someone who is lost, but as someone who cries out to the only one who can rewrite history. He did not argue forcefully. He did not debate logically. He simply opened his heart. Remember, Lord, how I have walked before you in faithfulness and integrity. It was a direct, simple human cry. True. And it was enough. Isaiah was still in the courtyard when the answer came. The same God who had said, you shall die, now says, go back and tell Hezekiah, this is what the Lord says. I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your days. Yes, God changed his mind. The heavens moved. Time was extended, because there is something more powerful than a decree, sincere prayer. The kind that comes from the depths, not from appearances. The kind that springs up when we have nowhere else to run but to him. This is the power of Hezekiah's story. That of a broken king who found power not in his victories, but in his surrender. And of a God who, even though he is sovereign, bends down to listen to those who seek him with all their hearts. The room was still the same. The walls, the bed, the fever that burned Hezekiah's body, everything was the same. But something invisible had changed, because now heaven was listening. The cry of a broken man had crossed the eternal gates, and that changes everything. It wasn't a long prayer. It wasn't an elaborate speech. It was a silent cry, accompanied by tears. Hezekiah wasn't trying to convince God with arguments. He was trying to reach God's heart with sincerity. And that's exactly where many get confused. We think we need the right words, the perfect posture, impeccable faith, but God isn't impressed by performance. He moves by truth. Hezekiah turns his face to the wall. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. He disconnects from the world. He turns off the sounds, the advice, even the presence of the prophet, because there are prayers that can only be said in secret. places where only two people can be, man and his God. Remember, Lord, that's how it begins. Not with demands, but with remembrance, as if to say, I know your character, I know who you are, and I know that you know me too. It is not arrogance, it is intimacy. It is someone who has walked with God for years and now cries out for mercy, not based on merit, but on the covenant, and the miracle happens even before the answer arrives. Because the true miracle is not the extension of life, it is heaven responding, it is God bending down, it is the Almighty enthroned upon the cherubim, hearing the plea of a mortal king. Isaiah had not even left the courtyard when the voice of God interrupts him. Return. This is one of the most beautiful scenes in the Bible. The prophet who came to announce death returns with life. Hezekiah did not know it yet. He remained lying down, weak, with his face wet from crying. But heaven had already decreed, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears, I will give you 15 more years. Friend, do you have any idea what this means? A divine decree was reversed, the sentence was revoked, because someone prayed, because someone cried with faith. Because someone had the courage to cry out even when everything said it's over. This is the power of prayer. Not just any prayer, but the prayer that breaks through the sky. The one made at the limit, on the ground, in pain. The one that doesn't depend on a scenario or an immediate response, but that touches God's heart because it comes from a broken heart. And if it worked for Hezekiah, it can work for you. Lembra-te, Senhor. É assim que começa, não com exigências, mas com lembrança, como quem diz, eu conheço o teu caráter, sei quem tu és, e sei que tu me conheces também. Não é arrogância, é intimidade, é alguém que caminhou com Deus por anos e agora clama por misericórdia, não com base no merecimento, mas na aliança. E o milagre acontece antes mesmo da resposta chegar. Porque o verdadeiro milagre não é o prolongamento da vida, é o céu responder, é Deus se inclinar, é o Altíssimo entronizado sobre os querubins, ouvir a súplica de um rei mortal. Isaías não havia nem saído do pátio quando a voz de Deus o interrompe. Volta, essa é uma das cenas mais lindas da Bíblia. O profeta que veio anunciar a morte volta com a vida. Ezequias não sabia ainda. Continuava deitado, fraco, com o rosto molhado de choro. Mas o céu já havia decretado: ouvi tua oração, vi tuas lágrimas, te darei mais 15 anos. Amigo, você tem ideia do que isso significa? Um decreto divino foi revertido, a sentença foi revogada, porque alguém orou, porque alguém chorou com fé, porque alguém teve coragem de clamar mesmo quando tudo dizia acabou. Essa é a força da oração, não de qualquer oração, mas da oração que rompe o céu, aquela feita no limite, no chão, na dor, aquela que não depende de cenário nem de resposta imediata, mas que toca o coração de Deus porque vem de um coração quebrantado. E se funcionou com Ezequias, pode funcionar com você. What would you do if you were sentenced to death? If a prophet of God said, get your house in order because there is no more time? Most would despair. Some would surrender. Others would try to negotiate. But Hezekiah chose something more. Powerful, he prayed, and the answer came, not from men, not from doctors, but from heaven itself. Go back and tell Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. The same God who said, you will die, now says, I will give you 15 more years. And here is the mystery that makes us tremble and at the same time fills us with hope. Prayer can change destiny, not because God changes his mind like a fickle man, but because he responds to the sincere faith of a broken heart. Hezekiah's prayer was not a spell or a formula. It was an encounter. It was the outburst of someone who knows the character of God. It was the cry of someone who does not accept the end without first fighting on his knees. And this kind of prayer, God honors. God's answer was not just in words, it came with a sign. Isaiah says, as proof that God will fulfill what he promised, the shadow will go back 10 degrees on the clock of Ahaz. A cosmic miracle. Time literally went back. The universe responded to the decree of heaven. It was not just an extension of life. It was a reversal of the natural, a visible intervention that showed, when God speaks, even time obeys. Hezekiah experiences the faithfulness of a God who listens, of a Father who sees tears, of a Lord who acts even when everything seems sealed. That deathbed became an altar of miracles. That wall where he cried became a portal of life. That sentence became a promise. But this answer also brings a lesson. The time that God gives us is to be used with purpose. It is not just more life, it is more opportunity, more chance to live with gratitude, with reverence, with boldness. And perhaps you are experiencing something similar. A diagnosis, a loss, a closed door, something you've been told is the end. But today, through the story of Hezekiah, God whispers to your heart, it's not over yet. There are answers you haven't seen yet. There are promises you'll yet experience. There is extra time that heaven can release, not to satisfy selfish desires, but to fulfill a destiny he himself has written. When God answers, even the impossible obeys. Maybe you are not fighting for another 15 years of life like Hezekiah, but you are fighting for something, for a miracle, for a new beginning, for an answer. And when everything seems sealed, when the diagnosis has already been given, when the door seems locked, that is when prayer becomes more than words. It becomes spiritual warfare. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall. A simple gesture, but profound. He did not look at the soldiers, the servants, or the circumstances. He turned to God. Because sometimes, to experience what heaven has to offer, you have to disconnect from what the world shows you. And here is the key. He prayed with truth. He did not try to impress. He did not use pretty words. He cried. He reminded God of his heart. He was honest, and it is this spiritual honesty that breaks down barriers. It is this vulnerability that touches heaven. How many times do we try to take everything into our own hands when the greatest power we have is surrender? Prayer is the only weapon that works when all others fail, and more than moving God's hand, it transforms our hearts. You may be faced with a no, faced with something that seems immutable, but Hezekiah reminds us there are no's that God transforms into yes when our hearts break. Not because he owes us anything, but because he loves to surprise us with mercy. The application is direct. Don't stop praying. Don't stop believing. Even when the word seems final, even when the prophets say it's over, the last word will never be man's. It belongs to God. And prayer is more than a request. It is an act of trust. It is saying, I know who you are, even when I don't understand what you are doing. It is in this place of raw faith, of sincere tears and total dependence that heaven bends down. The question that remains is, what are you doing with the time that God has already given you? Because each day, each breath, each opportunity is a chance to live with purpose, to make it count, to mark this generation with faith, with love, with courage. Don't wait for a sentence to begin praying intensely. Don't wait for urgency. To seek deeply, start today. Because if prayer changed the destiny of a king, it can change yours too. Hezekiah lived because he prayed. The sentence was changed because God heard him. What about you? Have you given your pain to him? Have you truly cried out? Share in the comments what you hope to see God do in your life. Like, subscribe, and activate the bell here at Bible in Colors. Each story is a bridge between the Word and your heart. Until the next video. If Hezekiah's story teaches us that prayer can change destinies, Daniel's story reveals that it also sustains us in the midst of the impossible. When Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, he had no guarantees, only faith. Like Hezekiah, he trusted in God's character even in the face of death. If this message spoke to you, watch Daniel in the lion's den, When God is All You Have Now, and discover how faithfulness can pave the way in the midst of chaos.